Hello and welcome. Our topic for this week's module is library and information organizations. A lot of the material you're going to find in the readings, so this is kind of an organizational lecture. I want to bring a few ideas, concepts, and so on to your attention, and then you can discuss the particulars in your discussion groups. So for the week, we want to think about the general characteristics of library and information organizations. What do they look like? What are the different kinds? Various types of information organizations, and we want to look at what audiences they serve. We want to look at the kind of competencies you need to work for different types of information organizations. And we want to look at different professional organizations supporting various types of information organizations. So for the lecture, let's just talk a little bit about how we define an information organization. Let's talk a little bit about libraries, change, and the necessity for change, how libraries can keep up with change. We'll take a quick functional look at libraries, although much of that material is in the readings. We'll take a quick look at library and information mediation work. We've looked at this before, so this will be just a little bit of a refresher. And then we want to introduce the concept of first day ready and lifelong learning. So, what is an information organization? Patrick Wilson, who is sometimes known as the father of bibliographic control, talks about libraries as an assemblage of institutions and organizations that collectively take the output of the publishing industry and try to make it accessible to the public. That was back in 1984. I think probably in 1984 that was a pretty good definition. We have a kind of a stereotypical view of the library as a large building with a bunch of published books in it. Librarians working to mediate that information, select it, make it available to readers, and so on. Libraries cover both intellectual access and physical access. By that I mean they cover the information about the information resources, as well as making the resources available. Sometimes those have been different in the past. The typical public library, a lot of it's the same. We have the bibliographic records, the card catalogs, and so on in the library, which is also where the books are in the library. But there are other models. And of course now times change. So if we want to update our view of information organizations, we really need to include recorded knowledge and published materials that are found on the web, and that introduces a whole vast array of materials that libraries have never really had to deal with before. So maybe we could rephrase this a little bit to be an assemblage of institutions and organizations that collectively take the output of recorded knowledge and try to make it accessible to the public. We've substituted recorded knowledge in there for published material, noting that recorded knowledge has really moved beyond the control of one particular industry, that is the publishing industry. So recorded knowledge comes from many, many different kinds of places. And an information organization is an entity that deals directly with some body of recorded knowledge, providing intellectual access or physical access, or both. So we really need to kind of extend our thinking a little bit. Now, it's important to distinguish information organizations from organizations that use information. So many other kinds of organizations use recorded knowledge, but they do it in order to accomplish another goal. So if we're going to look at information organizations in society, we want to look at a kind of a diachronic view, the view across time and space. Earlier you've looked at what Jesse Shera had to say about librarians. He didn't really comment specifically on libraries and information organizations, but let's think about what, if he did, he might have said. So information organizations a la Jesse Shera, if we just sort of twist his definition of librarians around a little bit from what you've looked at previously, we might say that information organizations provide mediation between recorded knowledge and users. And that's very similar to our definition of librarians. There are many different kinds of organizations, information organizations, of course, and so one of the things you need to do is think about those different kinds. That's something you can discuss in your group. In this lecture and in this unit, we're focusing primarily on libraries as information organizations, You've previously read about convergence. There are many different kinds of what we call cultural memory organizations, cultural heritage organizations. These include archives, museums, other kinds of organizations. And they also mediate information, broadly in context. So we can really extend this conversation beyond our immediate discussion of libraries, and that's something for you to think about, although we won't go into too much detail here. So the Shara-style definition of a library. Would it follow Wilson's definition and restrict libraries to take the output of the publishing industry and make it available? Or would it extend much more broadly? That's really kind of hard to say. Sure, it didn't give us a definition of a library. So you might think about whether you think Shara's definition would be extended. But it certainly is true that libraries have, for a long time, fulfilled many different roles just beyond the output of the publishing industry. So, think about those different kinds of roles and the different kinds of roles that libraries fill today. So you can talk about a few of them in your groups. We've previously talked about, of course, different kinds of information services. Libraries also now and in the past have been in the business of making meeting room space available for the community, sponsoring all kinds of programming, events, lectures, providing interactions around literacy, things like homework help, job search, health information, providing space for the creation of objects. That's becoming very popular right now. We're calling them maker spaces. Where we have maybe even 3D printers and technology and all kinds of stuff so that people can make things. We've had community centers for youth, safe places for youth to stay, point places for community services such as health services, voter registration, access to the internet. I'm sure you can think of a lot more, so please feel free to discuss this in your groups and kind of come up with a list of the different kinds of roles that libraries often play today. And be sure to think of all different kinds of libraries. The general issues facing libraries today, a lot of it stems from an increasingly, what we call our increasingly e-society, the focus of technology, social media, all of the other kinds of things that internet and web technologies have brought to libraries. So we're having issues deciding what are recorded objects, how do we categorize them, which ones do we acquire. We need to know how to distribute them. There are all kinds of digital information objects now. Mainstream published objects are print, some are digital only. We need to think about the kinds of information services and instruction services that we need to provide. What is our approach to community spaces and services? Do we focus on objects or do we focus on mediation and mediators? Where does the funding come from? And what is the acceptance of the community for the different kinds of roles that libraries are taking on now? So think about those things. Change is a part of libraries. We've previously talked about managing change in organization, and that was to kind of set the stage for you to think about how libraries have been changing. Libraries have been changing since the 1960s. Arguably, they were changing before that, but I think at least up until the 1960s when we first began to see digital technologies in libraries, change has been continual and in some cases rapid and in some cases pretty disruptive. If you think about the changes just in some of the roles of librarians, a reference desk, for example, used to be printed books. Librarians would be experts at knowing what was in the books and the reference books and finding that information. Now, of course, reference has gone almost completely to the web, the internet and the web. Now, we still need librarians to know where that information is, know what the good information is, and know how to get it. But it's completely changed the role of the library. A lot of the changes are due to technology, so starting with card catalogs, which was OCLC's first contribution. The making of actual physical cards was actually kind of revolutionary. It took the role of bibliographic description out of the local library and put it into the hands of a larger organization that did a lot of descriptive cataloging for everyone on a shared model. All of the network services we have now, interlibrary loan, different kinds of bibliographic search, federated searching across libraries, a lot of the automation of library processes, things like online catalogs, federated catalogs, where you now can view the holdings of many different libraries at once for the purpose of interlibrary loan. Of course, libraries working with web resources. We're going to be looking at the digital face of libraries and digital collections outside libraries in some future lectures. So libraries have been changing, and they really need to continue to change. Technology is not stopping or holding still, nor are many other of our social conventions. So libraries need to be constantly aware of change, be ready to change, be adaptable. So how do they do this? I think in the early 90s, one approach was discussed at length by Peter Senge. I think the first book perhaps was The Fifth Discipline. You can read about it at that Wikipedia link if you would like to learn more about it. But he described the concept of a learning organization, which is an organization that facilitates the learning of its members and continually transforms itself. So by learning organization, we don't mean an organization like a school that teaches people how to learn things, but the fact that the organization itself is a learning entity and needs to go through processes to make sure that the institution and the people in it have learned the kinds of things that they need to do to adapt to make their services effective and available to their constituency. So we might say that the learning library is one that facilitates the learning of its members and continuously transforms itself. So I'd like you to think about what activities in a library would facilitate the learning of its staff and customers, and what continuing transformation might look like. So that's something for you to think about, to look at the readings associated with this model, and to discuss that concept of a learning organization, a learning library, in your discussion groups. I'd like to introduce a concept that may make sense to you as we think about how libraries need to respond to their customers, is the primacy of audience, the concept of this primacy of audience, that the library's audience shapes not only what the library does, but how it changes. So we need to think about who is the audience. We need to think about this holistically. How do we define an audience or a customer base for a library? Is it taxpayers? Is it people living in a catchment area? By that we mean a kind of a geopolitical area, like a city or a division or a neighborhood. Of course, libraries have global audiences through websites. So as we think about audience, we need to think about how do we define our audience? How do we define it? How do we respond to them? And then we have to not just follow the audience, but we actually have to stay ahead of them. Now, the major reading you have for this week is from a textbook, Rubin's book on library and information science. And he goes into a pretty good discussion of the different kinds of libraries, what comprises them, what services they do. So you'll get a lot of detailed information from that reading that I'm not going to go to in this lecture. So you'll learn about different kinds of libraries, and you'll also learn about them from librarians, from library associations, from some of the competencies you'll look at for various types of librarianship. So you're going to want to learn about different kinds of libraries. You'll learn these from the readings and these other sources that we mention here. We'll take a minute to go into a little bit of detail on a functional view of the libraries. This is actually handled pretty well in the Rubin reading, so I'm not going to try to do a lecture on those, just to kind of summarize as you go through that reading some things to think about that he talks about in the reading. Governing bodies, these are the library boards that basically give direction to the library. There's, of course, administration, all of the administration that has to be done to keep a library running. The different kinds of public service units, there's a good discussion in the Rubin reading of these. We're talking about things like reference, circulation, archives. There are several more of these. We're talking about technical services, things like acquisitions, how do we get the material in, serials, of course, all the magazines, journals, and so on, how do we manage those? Then, of course, even with the benefits we get from OCLC and all their copy cataloging, we still need to pay attention to cataloging and classification, and we also have to take a look at preservation for different kinds of records, and that includes now preservation of digital records, which, as you'll find if you take a couple of courses later on in your Searles career, digital preservation is probably harder than you think, so you'll learn about that. And of course, then there are support units, maintenance, public relations, security, the whole support of what we call the integrated library system. These are the large computer systems that do everything from checkout and reservations to bibliographic review, all kinds of things. So these are covered fairly well in the readings, and I'll let you talk about those in your discussion sections. You may see some reference to libraries of the Mintzberg model. This is a way of looking at the different components of libraries, how they fit together. If you look at the diagram on the left there, the strategic apex really is the function of your organization. That's the outreaching part that your customers directly interact with. We have an operating core down there. These are a lot of the facilities management kind of a thing, the thing that really holds the organization together. We have technostructure on the left, and we have support staff on the right. So this is a way that of looking at an organization that kind of places the different functions of the organization in a kind of an interrelated context. If you look at the diagram on the right, there are different tensions within an organization. The view on the right is one particular way of looking at all the different poles of organizations to collaborate, to standardize, to centralize, to professionalize. You can take this for what it's worth, but it's a model that you at least ought to have seen and know a little bit about. Now, another way to distinguish libraries is by size. We often look at libraries by size because some people feel that large libraries have more in common with other large libraries than with smaller libraries of the same type. So a very large public library might have more in common with, say, a very large academic library than a large public library might have with a very small public library. And similarly, the small libraries have their own set of problems regardless of what type they are. And some libraries are even solo libraries, which is a library operated by only one person or with only one librarian. So you can imagine that the issues that face those kind of libraries are very much different than the large libraries that may have perhaps hundreds of employees and librarians all working. When we talk about large libraries, we often talk about large libraries in the context of a bureaucracy. You can read a little bit about that at the Wikipedia link if you want to get a little bit more background. I think most of us have a kind of a general idea of what a bureaucracy is. Governance by knowledge, standardized rules, standard divisions or offices, standard qualifications, not appointed or elected, the typical hierarchical kind of structure. There's probably nothing wrong with a bureaucracy per se. Bureaucracies do have some advantages. They have some disadvantages. And I'd like you to discuss those in your group to see if you can ferret out what some of the advantages and disadvantages of bureaucracy might be. And then also think about what has given bureaucracy a bad name. We tend to think of bureaucracies as somehow inefficient and dinosaurs and so on. So that may be true. Think about what kinds of difficulties large bureaucratic structures have that have given them a bad name. And again, that's something to discuss in your groups. There are some alternatives to bureaucratic structure, and these have come out in the past 20, 30, 40 years. You can find structures within bureaucracies that are designed to address some of the disadvantages of the problems. So, for example, many bureaucracies have implemented team structure. They go by a number of different titles: team management, matrix management, total quality management, or some of the names that you might see. And these are a way of implementing team structures, opening up communication channels within an organization that remains fundamentally bureaucratic. There are some ideas for doing away with bureaucracy altogether. You could read about Heckscher's post-bureaucratic structural ideas. These include decisions by dialogue and consensus. We don't have authority to control. The hierarchical structure of the institution is very flat. So there really is no big, deep hierarchy of employees and managers and mid-level managers and upper-level managers and so on. The organizations are flat, open at the boundaries. There are processes for decisions that involve communication across structures rather than up and down within structures. And then, of course, you can do away with organization entirely. This is the kind of guys in a garage model where people just get the work done. Tends to kind of fall apart in larger organizations. Larger organizations need some structure. But it kind of depends on where you want to draw the line. So just to kind of give you an idea of what I'm talking about, this is a typical bureaucratic org chart. You can see it's very top to bottom, bottom to top, hierarchical. The lines of communication basically go up or down. There's very little communication across groups and so on. And so I'm sure you've all seen this kind of org chart before. You've probably worked in an organization that had one. On the other hand, if you look at more of a team model sample, you can see that we're a little bit flatter, although you can make the argument that you could redraw this and it would still look like a bureaucracy. But there are some differences with a team model in approach, concept, and communication structures that do make a significant difference here. So just something to think about. Small and solo libraries, many of you are going to be attracted to that. They have a completely different set of issues than the larger bureaucratic organizations do. It is a continuum, so we can be talking about solo libraries, or we can be talking about small libraries with just a handful of people. We can sometimes define these by the service population, so if a library is serving an area of fewer than 25,000 people, sometimes we call those small libraries. Different set of organizational issues that you need to deal with in terms of allocating functions, how you divide up the work. Generally in smaller organizations, people have to be jacks of all trades, do different things at different times. So there's an upside. It's a very flexible kind of a job. You get a lot of different variety in the kinds of things that you do during the day. The downside is that there's usually more work to be done than can be done. And one other thing to mention is that sometimes a small or solo library is actually part of a larger organization. The larger organization may itself be a bureaucracy, but it will have some kind of a library function within a larger organization. A larger organization may have a different mission than the library unit itself. So that's something to think about. So let's talk a little bit about library and information mediation work. We've talked about these before, but now I'd like you to think about them in the context of the different kinds of libraries, the different kinds of audiences that libraries have, and how these different kinds of tasks, how this work varies by type of library and by type of audience. I'm not going to read you this list, but I would like you to take a look at it and perhaps discuss in your groups how these different kinds of library and information mediation aspects vary according to different libraries, different types of libraries, and different kinds of audiences. So, what kind of a library and information mediator sounds good to you? You need to think about which kind of work, what kind of institution. Do you like a bigger organization, a smaller organization? Is there a particular type of user or customer that you want to work with? What are the different kinds of technologies? Different technologies are at play in different sizes of organizations, for example. What about the parent organizations, the boards, who you're responsible? So think about what you would like to do. And again, this is good for group discussion, but mostly it's good for you to start thinking about this now so you know how to model your studies as you go through the program and how to start looking for the kind of professional opportunity that suits you when you complete your studies. So let's talk about this concept of first day ready. This is the idea that a library school will train a person to be a librarian, to learn all there is to know about librarianship so that you can walk out diploma in hand into any type of library or information organization, sit down at a desk and start doing your job. And so that's a kind of a myth. Clearly there are all kinds of different jobs. Library school certainly can't train you for every single one of them. And of course, in just a very short period of time, you won't be able to build up the experience you need to do some of the more complex functions with expertise right off the bat. So there are many different kinds of library jobs. Perhaps the job that you will end up loving doesn't even exist yet. It may involve a new technology, a new service. It may be a position that you create for yourself. So what you need to do is to have the knowledge structure to recognize what you see in context. What are the basic functions and tasks of information organizations, of people who work in information organizations, so that you can recognize what the work is and then work immediately to start to learn the particulars. And that means lifelong learning. We talk about this a lot. Lifelong learning is not only refers to the learning library, but to the learning librarian. It means that you have to be ready always to take on new tasks, to learn new things, to learn new services, new technologies. So now you begin to form patterns of how you'll identify what you need to learn and how you'll need to prepare yourself for learning as you move into your career. How can you start on that path? So think about some tools, some techniques that you can use to prepare yourself now for what might be a very different kind of a future. Discuss that in your groups. And I think I'll close the lecture on this note and let you get back to your reading and discussion. Hope this has provided some context for you to look at the readings and manage the discussion in your group. So thank you very much, and I look forward to listening or reading your discussion threads. Thank you.